England, 1875. The drawing room at the Marlowe residence smelled of burned tallow and old paper. The late autumn light creeping through leaded panes like a thin confession, and the city beyond the curtains moved with the indifferent rhythm of carriage wheels and clipped footfalls. At 40 years old, Eleanor Marlowe had become, in the polite voice of society, an unfortunate exemplar of faded promise. A widow with more years of restraint than of public amusement, observed with a mixture of pity and a discreet approving nod when she performed the duties expected of her, and dismissed with a smile when her presence did not serve tonight's amusement. "She keeps to the back parlor as if the house might forget her," Lady Beatrice murmured to Mrs. Langley while fanning away a tear she would not allow herself, the fan whispering like a small defeated bird. The inciting moment that would unseat that careful equilibrium happened with the casual cruelty of a dropped glove, when the Duke of Ashford, tall, composed, and rumored to have all the world's discretion, paused not to offer a salute to the young debutantes arrayed like lilies on parade, but to study Eleanor across the room as if he had found an unread page in an old family Bible. And the hush that followed felt to everyone present like the catching of a single held breath. The scent of heated wood and lemon polish mixed with the faint perfume of boxwood that clung to Eleanor's gloves, and her pulse moved like an oar across a small resistant river. This was not merely a glance, it seemed, but the first note in a composition that would not resolve as anyone anticipated. Will the world that has counted her invisible learn to see her at last? Stay with the story to find out how a single look altered the course of a life thought settled. The narrator will guide you through the whispers, the letters, the rooms where reputations are measured like tea, and the quiet revolutions that happen in a single human heart. Eleanor was not a woman fashioned from melodrama. She had the careful, steady qualities of linen pressed twice and put away, but her past held small, unhealed interruptions that shaped the way she moved and what she allowed herself to feel. And in telling her backstory, there is no artifice that will smooth the corners. She had been a farmer's daughter in Kent, her childhood full of the sharp smell of cut hay and the honest, blunt affection of a family who read at supper and mended boots without apology. And the memory of sunlight folding along a fence-board remained a province of comfort in her mind. At 17 she had married Thomas Marlowe, a solicitor with a steady hand who loved tidy ledgers and the way she laughed. And those early years were measured by receipts, by the slow arrival of a house warmed by a shared purpose, by mornings when tea could be brewed with impatience that was more hope than complaint. Then came illness, that insistent thud of winter into life, and in a single season Thomas was gone, leaving Eleanor with a small inheritance and a larger obligation, the kind that names you guardian of a reputation rather than an owner of joy. She learned to live with the echo of his absent voice in the corners of the house, to listen for the click of a door that would not open, and to answer to a social script that applauded restraint while never truly welcoming her to the warmth of company. She lost, as many do, not only a man but the future she had imagined, and with that loss came a careful diplomacy that allowed her to move among the titled with humility and no small measure of skill. This sequence of losses and obligations taught her to read a room, to measure a compliment, to answer with a smile when scorn was offered like a stale biscuit. Those years shaped her reserve not as armor, but as a trained kind of economy. She gave as little as necessary and kept, beneath the surface, a well of feeling that she had been taught to ration. The memory of her sonnet books hidden beneath the hearthstone, the languages she studied in spare hours, the small rebellions of buying a ribbon in an unexpected color, all of these remained private ornaments on a woman who had been taught to keep her treasures in the dark. Across town, the Duke of Ashford, Marquis Pembroke, carried his own ledger of silence, though his entries were made of travels and portraits and the careful conversations of men who kept the city steady. He was called charming in the papers and austere at afternoon clubs, a man whose face was practiced into an expression of gentle reserve, and whose reputation was measured by attendance at committee meetings and by the discreet generosity of his gifts to the Royal Academy. He had been raised in a household of dutiful servants and precise table settings, where the language of affection was a folded napkin and a directed glance, and his youth had been shaped by the knowledge that his duties were larger than his appetites. Marcus had loved once in a way that left him both grateful for the memory and wary of its ruins, a courtship that had ended in the kind of misfortune that severs trust in the world much as a frost severs petals, and from that he learned caution. Yet there remained in him an aesthetic hunger, a desire to find something unshowy and true, which he fed in quieter rooms, walking among sculptures, reading marginalia in donated books, listening more than he spoke. That appetite made his attention to Eleanor appear at once improbable and inevitable to those who watched from the parlor doors. His backstory was composed in small things: the tutor who taught him French, the tutor who taught him restraint, the summer he spent in Florence sketching strangers, the night he discovered his fondness for the private corners of libraries where old correspondence sat like relics, and each of these things explained why, when he paused by Eleanor, he saw not a curate's widow, but a person who carried a life in the folds of her gloves. These 3 or 4 impressions of Marcus are not the whole of him, but they account for why a man with title and habit might be dislodged by an honest human presence rather than the parade of youth and jewels. They explain his curiosity without excusing his mistakes, and they stand as a reminder that the heart keeps accounts no ledger can balance. The first scene after that glance unfolded with the ceremony of tiny disasters as the household adjusted to a pattern of renewed attention. The servants noticed before the noble guests did, and the way Mrs. Langley lowered her voice when Eleanor passed suggested a new vigilance. "She seems to breathe differently," Matron Agnes told the cook, the statement as much an observation as a wish. And the cook, Mr. Cartwright, grunted with the approval of a man who knows his bread dough will rise if the room is slightly warmer. Among the named observers were Lady Beatrice, who whispered to Mrs. Langley, Sir Edmund, who cleared his throat and offered a card of introduction to anyone who required proof of propriety, Reverend Hale, who took note of the moral implications and filed them quietly away, Miss Cartwright, who delighted in dresses and commented on trim with the frankness of youth, Lord Ashby, who watched with a proprietorial brow and later sent flowers with an inscrutable ribbon, Miss Herbert, who instructed her young charges to look and not stare, and Mr. Pembroke's steward, Mr. Holloway, who recorded details for the Duke with the patient hand of someone who inventories more than homes. Each of these people reacted in a way that revealed their character, not simply as chorus, but as agents who shaped the social atmosphere into which Eleanor stepped with an uncertain foot. The exchanges were small yet revealing. "A pity to see such a woman alone," Lady Beatrice said like a verdict. "She is not alone if she is content," Eleanor replied softly to Sir Edmund when he offered a remark meant to soothe, and her voice carried, against expectation, a quiet correctness that silenced the room. The smell of coal smoke and the metallic tang of teacups punctuated the conversation, while the soft scrape of a chair leg on the oak floor provided the kind of rhythm that makes a memory take hold. It was inevitable that something tangible would follow the look, and a tome arrived at Eleanor's house the next morning, wrapped in brown paper and addressed in an unfamiliar hand, the same hand that had paused in the drawing-room as if it were studying script like a new species. The book was a volume of 17th-century poetry with pressed foxglove between its pages, and the note inside was brief, written with a pen that had been careful to avoid flourish. "To Miss Marlowe, for reasons I shall explain in speech when the propriety of the world permits." The thing itself carried the sound of a decision. It smelled faintly of oil and glue, and of someone who had taken the time to choose rather than to perform. Eleanor read the note twice in the kitchen, the spine warming under her palms, and then she placed the foxglove upon the mantel like a small, dangerous truth. The delivery triggered ripples, small enough to be called gossip, yet large enough to rearrange seating charts at the next salon. Her sister, Beatrice Marlowe, returned from a visit to insist on caution, her voice pitched between affection and reproach. "You must not bring invitations into the drawing room without vetting," Beatrice said, counting the social cost as if it were a tax to be assessed. "What if it is a jest?" Eleanor answered, and found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid of laughter. The book and the foxglove became a symbol, like a ring or a portrait, of interest that was not mere rumor. In the garden, the scent of wet earth and the sharp sweetness of crushed mint accompanied her thoughts, and she wondered if a life of measured days could permit the disturbance she felt like a small, insistent song. Public encounters followed with the deliberate choreography of society, and the pair were seen in galleries, at the conservatory, and once at the Royal Academy, where they stood before a painting of landscape and said little yet signaled much to those watching. At the gallery, Marcus spoke of a brushstroke with the expertise of someone who had looked at art to learn the shape of human compromise, while Eleanor listened and then remarked with an honest curiosity about the way a color held grief, and that single observation made a group of younger men fall silent. Their dialogue in public was a test of tone and of boundaries, and each remark took on the pressure of consequence. "Do you think the painter intended sorrow?" Marcus asked thoughtfully. "I cannot say," Eleanor replied, "but I think sorrow chose that color." The crowd of onlookers included Lady Beatrice, who commented with thin amusement. "He trades in charm, and finds it fashionable to notice what others have dismissed." Sir Edmund approached with the manner of an intermediary. "Duke, might I introduce you to Mrs. Sutherland?" he began, but the Duke's attention lingered elsewhere, as if he were reluctant to break the new, fragile focus that had settled over him. Miss Cartwright whispered of Eleanor's choice of gloves, of the mild scandal of color, while Lord Ashby arranged to be near enough that his shadow might suggest a protest without a word, and Reverend Hale observed with the sober gaze of someone cataloging. Moral possibilities. In each of these small scenes, the sensory details accumulated. The clink of wine glasses, the tang of paint thinner, the softness of velvet, until the public landscape felt heavy with meaning, and the simplest exchange could be read as a declaration or a transgression. Their conversations were layered, each line containing a surface remark and a submerged truth, and the observers spoke in tones that mixed envy and hope. The Duke bought an illustrated folio for Eleanor at a charity auction, not the most expensive lot, but one that bore a note of private judgment. And when the catalog was delivered to her home, the paper rustled like an argument behind the hearth. At roughly 1/3 into this unfolding, when the affair had migrated from a private curiosity to a matter of salon discussion, the narrator pauses to speak directly to you, the viewer, with a gentle question about the moment that first disturbed the social calm. If you felt a tightening around the chest when Marcus first looked across the room, you are not alone, and many in the parlor felt the same current of surprise, like finding a letter you had not expected. Tell us in the comments what moved you most in these early pages of the story. Begin your sentence with, "I was struck by," and name the scene that lodged in you, whether it was the foxglove pressed between the poetry, or the way Eleanor answered Sir Edmund. Your voice will help others find what staggered them in the same place, and may inspire our next tale of persons who defy quiet lives. Your insight matters to the community we are building, and will be read by others who come to these narratives for solace and curiosity. Now return to the rooms of marble and coal smoke and watch how a small invitation becomes a test of courage. After that gentle appeal, we continue. The family responded with a private tension that had the shape of a siege rather than of a storm. And in the Marlowe parlor, conversations about prudence became arguments about identity. Beatrice worried aloud to Eleanor's niece, Anna, who was dear and clever and inclined to speak plainly. "You must remember that reputations are like crystal, one careless movement and they shatter." Anna, who preferred the company of books to that of fans, answered with an impatience that pleased her aunt and concerned her mother in equal measure. Aunt Eleanor has been steady all her life. She deserves a joy if it comes, and who are we to deny it? The dialogue that followed in the family was longer and more intricate than it might at first appear. Eleanor confessed a fragment of her inner fear to Anna at the fireside. "I do not want to be the subject of gossip for my own foolishness. I do not wish to be a story told in a drawing room for amusement." "But if the story is one of happiness," Anna pressed, "is it not better than silence?" The conversation stretched into questions about duty, love, and practicalities, and each answer added to the emotional ledger. The chapter closed not with a decision, but with an acceptance that choices would be made and that some of them would be public. The sensory backdrop of that evening was a rain that rattled on the slates above like a small, persistent applause. The smell of lemon peel in the tea, the soft crease of a page turned as Anna read the poetry Marcus had sent, and the click of knitting needles which Eleanor used when she needed to think. An invitation to Blackhurst Park arrived with the kind of formality that suggested both a test and an entreaty. A carriage sent with 2 servants and a message that implied conversation beneath oak beams. Marcus requested a private dinner with Mrs. Marlowe to discuss a project of art patronage and conservation, and for Eleanor the invitation functioned as an admission and a risk. Her family counseled in tones measured between encouragement and fear, and she decided to accept with the sort of small, decisive will that builds life beyond grief. The journey to Blackhurst was described in a manner that paid attention to detail, for good reason, the carriage wheels whispering over country roads under a sky that smelled of turned moss and distant wood smoke. The coachman named Henry humming an old hymn under his breath as if to keep time with the horses. Upon arrival, the house rose with the familiarity of a place that had known decisive hands, the stone warmed by late sun, and the scent of orange oil from the conservatory drifting faintly through the halls. Marcus received Eleanor at the door with a manner both formal and oddly intimate. The room where they dined contained a portrait of his grandmother, a book of household accounts, and a window that framed trimmed hedges like a painting. Conversation moved from art to the care of books, to funding a local school, to Eleanor's experience with the Marlowe estate, and with each line there was more of the private truth of 2 people making themselves known and less of the performance required by the season. The immersion into Blackhurst revealed not only the Duke, but the architecture of his world, the people who sustained it, and his willingness to permit Eleanor into a sphere that had not previously been hers. Marcus's sister, Lady Helen, polite but watchful, tested Eleanor with small questions about household management and found her answers practical and unobtrusive. The steward, Mr. Holloway, observed accounts and murmured approval when Eleanor spoke of thrift with the knowledge of someone who keeps fine ledgers. The housekeeper, Mrs. Groves, warmed by a fondness for any woman who could mend a hymn, took Eleanor aside and showed her the silver polish with a seriousness that felt almost sacred. At dinner, the Duke's friend Sir Edwin recounted a hunting story that was both boast and apology, and the Duke laughed with a sound Eleanor had not expected, and which made a warm ache against her ribs. "You manage a home with dignity," Marcus said at one point, his voice careful, "and you read more than most people who count themselves learned." The compliment held no pretense of flattery. It was a recognition that in a world of surface, the Duke could name interiority. The sensory details of these evenings were vivid. The clink of cutlery, the toasted aroma of chestnut, the touch of linen under a palm, the low murmur of rain against leaded glass, and the quiet music that rose when conversation took on the tone of confession. Scenes were punctuated by dialogues that deepened character, with at least 8 exchanges that allowed each person to lay down small truths and tests. The servants, silent and skilled, arranged flowers, polished silver, and in these acts measured the possibility of change. The tension that built toward the watershed moment required its own restraint, and when the moment came, it was slowed down until every detail had weight, so that the reader might feel the solidity of the choice being made. They sat in the library, the fire a long, patient ember, and Eleanor had just placed a letter on the table that carried news of a trust reallocation, which could change her financial independence. Marcus watched her fingers as she smoothed the paper, noted the faint indentation where a pencil had mapped the margins, and took in the color of her face by the firelight. The dialogue that followed moved with the gravity of people crossing moats. "Eleanor," he said, "I have judged myself in past years by standards that pretend emotion is luxury. I see now that I have mistaken a refuge for a rule." She looked at him, the light catching in her eyes like glass, and she replied, "Do not speak as if you are absolved by seeing me. I have lived a long time in the margins of observation." Marcus reached for her hand, the gesture small and exacting, and the room seemed to hush as if it were listening. He then confessed his intention, not with the flourish of a romantic in a novel, but with the practical clarity of someone who measured consequences. "I wish to propose a union," he said slowly, "not because I am possessed of a sudden fancy, but because I believe your mind and steadiness would improve the governance of my house and the happiness of my days." There was a silence that folded over them, full of consequence and possibility, a moment when decisions could be deferred or embraced. For 2 paragraphs that stretch like held breath, the narrative shows the mechanics of a choice, the interior recalibration, and the social stakes. The scene occupies its own space to allow feeling to settle. Eleanor's reply was not immediate. She had rehearsed refusals, polite and stern replies that would preserve privacy. But the reality was more complicated and deeper than any rehearsal. "I will not marry you," she began, "if it is to be a theater of propriety alone. I will be counted in no ledger that calls itself a heart if it values only appearance." Marcus looked down as if that had been his fear put into words, and then said, "Nor would I have you if that is all I could offer. I seek a partner who will be my equal in care and conversation, not a decoration for my station." The decision that followed stemmed from mutual admission and an acceptance of vulnerability. And when Eleanor finally consented, it was with a clear voice that named the price and the hope. The silence afterward was both a relief and a recognition of risk, because to choose in a world that watches had always implied the possibility of reprisal. This moment of decision contained 2 paragraphs of slow detail in which the narrator described the duration of the pause, the way a teacup steamed in a corner, the smell of wet leaves carried from the garden, and the small grounding of breath. Word of the engagement made its way through salons and servant passages with speeds that varied according to interest and malice, and the reactions were predictably complex. Lady Beatrice expressed a controlled delight and considered it a triumph in social terms, while Lord Ashby raised a glass with a face that held a question like a blade hidden behind a ribbon. Sir Edmund, whose interest had been practical rather than passionate, offered congratulations in a tone that suggested relief at the restoration of order. Reverend Hale prepared a curious sermon on the dignity of late love, and Miss Cartwright embroidered a small handkerchief as tribute. Outside the house, the neighborhood watched with a mixture of astonishment and approval, and newspapers printed accounts that balanced between admiration and speculation on motive. At the ceremony, the room carried the scent of lilies and lemon oil. The Duke stood with a gravity he had shown elsewhere, and Eleanor, resplendent though simply dressed, felt the weight and the lift of being publicly acknowledged. They exchanged vows that were candid and not theatrical, and the public reconciliation of their lives was less a coronation than a mutual arrangement toward the future. The intimate life afterward was composed of small renegotiations, the sharing of books, the arrangement of dinner guests, the balancing of accounts, and the slow acceptance of each other's faults and virtues. The scenes that followed the wedding were rich with detailed domesticity, conversations measured by affection and corrected by a shared desire for truth. The legal and procedural particulars of their union were handled with care and recorded in a manner that required explanation for the sake of credibility. The solicitor drafted a settlement that preserved Eleanor's independence while establishing an equitable arrangement for household expenses. The document consisting of articles written in precise hand, specifying annuities and naming executors, with a clause on dower rights and a schedule for trust distributions that ensured both comfort and autonomy. The letter explaining the settlement used formal language, listed the names of trustees, and included dates and signatures. The ink on the page a small testament to care. These details, while dry on paper, served to make the narrative plausible and to show that love in their world could be practical and principled. In the weeks after the wedding, the couple confronted gossip and warmth in equal measure, the town's conversation shifting from curiosity to a slow acceptance that was not instantaneous but cumulative. There were scenes of quiet tenderness, evenings spent walking the grounds, afternoons in the library, and mornings when they shared the work of drafting letters and arranging endowments. They hosted dinners that included Lady Helen, Sir Edwin, Reverend Hale, and Miss Cartwright, each of whom contributed to the music of household life with judgments and kindness. The tension that remained was internal as much as external, the couple negotiating space, the definition of public action, and the management of opinion. Moments of conflict were rendered with 2 to 3 paragraphs each, so the stakes would unfold with a palpable sense of delay. One such scene involved a misunderstanding over a charitable donation, a heated exchange, and then a reconciliatory evening by the fire, where the Duke revealed a fear born in youth and Eleanor admitted a stubbornness she had inherited from her father. The repair consisted of small, honest sentences and gestures of affection that underscored their commitment. 1 month after the wedding, the household had settled into a rhythm that resembled acceptance more than novelty, the Duke and Eleanor accustomed to the porridge of morning and the books of the afternoon, and the servants adjusted to the new inner life of the home. Eleanor walked the garden at dawn and found that the roses she tended responded to her care with a generous bloom, the scent of damp earth and crushed petals becoming part of her contentment. And she began to plan a small charity for the children of the village with Lady Helen. Marcus became less formal in the mornings, writing brief notes to her with jokes tucked inside, and their conversations ranged from horticulture to the reform of the local school. The gossip that had once been sharp softened into anecdotes told at tea, and neighbors observed a woman who moved with more relaxation and a man whose smile held fewer calculations. Financially, things were ordered as promised, the solicitor's arrangements functioning as a comfortable scaffold that let them breathe. 3 months later, the changes were less visible but more profound. The couple now engaged in a project to restore a wing of the local school and to sponsor a small gallery that would display works by provincial artists, a project suggested by Eleanor and sanctioned by the Duke. The community responded with donations and curiosity. Miss Cartwright organized a small fundraising event, and Reverend Hale offered blessings that felt less like propriety and more like sincere support. Eleanor paraded not in jewels but in competence, supervising restorations, choosing paint that flattered the old beams, and writing to the mayor with the clear, firm prose that showed she could manage both hearts and accounts. Marcus learned to let her lead on matters of domestic reform, and in return, he asked her counsel on a matter of a memorial commission, revealing a trust that was not theatrical, but deepening. The sensory life of these months was ordinary in its details. The wax on a banister, the comfortable scrape of a chair, the smell of warmed porridge shared in silence. And these small things gathered into a form of intimacy that felt enduring. At 6 months, the impact of their union took a clearer shape, not solely in the house or in the magazines, but in the policy of a local charity that now received sustained support. The gallery that opened with a modest exhibit showing the talent of regional painters, and in the quietness of Eleanor's laughter, which had grown more frequent and less watchful. The couple hosted a small dinner for those who had resisted them at first, including Lord Ashby, who arrived with a face still reserved, but offered a public toast that suggested a softening rather than a full conversion. The household itself seemed to settle into an architecture of cooperation, and the servants spoke of the marriage as if it had stabilized the house rather than challenged it. The social consequences included a measured respect, invitations that had previously seemed unlikely, and a small but meaningful change in the town's conversation about late marriages. The moral effect on the community was visible in the improved funding for the school, in the gallery that made art accessible to more people, and in the example of a marriage founded on mutual respect rather than mere spectacle. In the end, Eleanor did not erase the years that had shaped her, nor did the Duke perform a miraculous reinvention of character, but together they constructed a life that recognized both their pasts and allowed for future work and compassion. She ceased to be merely presentable and became instead a woman who commanded presence, not by title alone, but by the strength of her decisions, her projects, and her daily acts of care. The result was concrete, not only in the form of their household and charitable initiatives, but in the slow changes of perception among friends and neighbors. The lesson carried by their story is simple and profound, that dignity and affection do not always arrive early, and that a heart is never too weathered to accept the warmth of another. If this narrative warmed you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to know that reinvention is possible at any stage. And if you wish to hear more stories that attend to quiet courage and the complex labor of living, a subscription ensures you will find them. Remember, it is rarely the loudest announcement that alters a life, and often the smallest, most sincere choice that reorders a world. For it is only in being seen that we finally learn to see others the way they deserve.